Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out on an evening late in the quarter. Especially you students, we appreciate that things are getting really, really busy, and it's not a small thing that you're here. We're grateful. Thank you. I'm Greg Johnson, director of the Walter H. Capps Center for the Study of Ethics, Religion, and Public Life here at UCSB. Each fall, we host an event having to do with environmental ethics, so we're just thrilled that that's happening now, but a few prefatory comments. We are on Chumash land, as many of you know, and it's their ancestral land, but it's also their contemporary and future land, and we want to acknowledge that. This institution has not always been a good steward of this place. I'd like to think we're turning the corner on that, and I hope we continue to be held accountable by Chumash people to do just that, to do better for their children. The Capps Center is grateful to our co-sponsors, the Departments of Religious Studies and Chicano Studies, the Environmental Studies Program, and the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UCSB for presenting tonight's lecture. We are also grateful to Dr. Gregory Jarrett, who helps organize this event annually and has done so tonight and has brought many of his students. So thank you, Greg. And he will be helping to moderate questions after Professor Baugh's lecture. As I said, this lecture is part of the Capps Center's Forum on Ethics and Public Policy. Each fall we host a lecture on this topic, and I want to flag for you that we have an upcoming event here at UCSB on a similar topic, and this is a book award presentation honoring Sarah McFarland Taylor's book, Eco-Piety, Green Media, and the Dilemma of Environmental Virtue. And that event, which is presented by the Environmental Studies Program, will take place on December 2nd. So note that. All right, just to name the reality, many of us are facing collective stress right now for obvious reasons. Just want to name that. And as I've been grappling with that myself, how do we turn this to productive purposes? Well, certainly here at the Capps Center, we're trying to do the obvious, which is to surface and recalibrate some of our priorities. And two of the obvious candidates for that are to focus upon issues of immigration and the environment. And so it's our good fortune in that respect that tonight's topic, planned well before the election, addresses these issues. So we're grateful for that and to be in solidarity in a safe space to think about these issues and, frankly, ways forward. We're honored to have Amanda Baugh with us to give this lecture, Falling in Love with Nature, the Values of Latinx Catholic Environmentalism. Amanda J. Baugh is professor and associate chair of religious studies and director of the MA program in sustainability at California State University, Northridge. Baugh specializes in the study of religion and American culture, focusing on the intersections of religion, race, and environmental justice. Her research explores power dynamics related to race, ethnicity, and class in the greening of American religion. She is the author of God and the Green Divide, Religious Environmentalism in Black and White, and the book after which this is titled, Falling in Love with Nature, the Values of Latinx Catholic Environmentalism, coming out this next week. Go to your bookstore or online to find it while it's still available before it sells out, because academic books always sell out. And then we get rich and retire. No. On that note of hopefulness, please help me welcome Professor Baugh. Thank you for being here. It's really great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I think you use this. So
I'll go ahead and use that, yeah. Cool. Thank you. Good evening. Does this sound all right? Yeah, okay. All right. Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Dusty, and thank you all for coming. I'm happy to see a lot of friends in the audience. It's very exciting to be here on your beautiful campus, so thank you very much. And I'm really happy to talk about my book here at UCSB, which, similar to Cal State Northridge, where I come from, is a Hispanic Serving Institute. The book that I'm about to tell you all about grew out of class conversations with my students. And I never would have written this book if I had landed somewhere else. I began formulating the questions for this book through conversations with my students who began to, they helped me see the limitations of the frameworks that I came to teach with that I had learned in grad school. And this book started as a research project for my religion and environmental justice class with CSUN undergrads. And I had students with me throughout the research, helping me interpret the findings as, we'd drive down the 405 and talk about what the people had just said. I had students helping me interpret everything. And I'm really happy to see all the students here today because truly I wrote the book for you. So I'd like to start by sharing a story from the book. Maritza, a 30-something charismatic Catholic and a daughter of Salvadorian immigrants, had embraced a set of environmentally sustainable behaviors, like conserving energy and water, recycling, and not wasting food, for as long as she could remember. As she told me about these behaviors when we met at her church in 2015, Maritza explained that she was not involved with any specific environmental ministries or organizations, and she did not consider environmentalism among her top priorities. But simple home-based conservation measures were mundane aspects of her everyday life. Maritza sometimes prayed to God for relief from the drought that had plagued Southern California in recent years. And she also helped the earth by cultivating cacti and other plants in pots throughout her home. Taking care of plants was important, Maritza maintained, because plants provided oxygen. She was worried about the world's oxygen supply, given scientists' dire warnings about greenhouse gases building up in the earth. And she suggested that planting more trees could be a more helpful response. If each person who cuts down a tree would plant 10 more so they can grow, Maritza suggested in Spanish, the planet would have enough oxygen. So Maritza's reflections come from a focus group that my students and I conducted in 2015 in a large, predominantly Latinx parish on the outskirts of LA. We were there because we wanted to better understand the results of a survey that had recently been released. So it was a survey conducted by the Public Religion Research Institute back in 2014. And it was basically talking about religious identity, religious values, and understandings and attitudes towards climate change. And so this is in alphabetical order, the list of all the groups that were included in the survey where they had statistically significant enough numbers in order to include them. So take a moment to look. Does anybody have a guess about who out of this list might be the most concerned about climate change? Rudy's already seen the survey, so he can't answer. No guesses? You want to guess?
I mean, just based off the name of the lecture, I'm going to assume it's
Yeah. That's smart UCSB degree working for you. Right. That is true. So it was Hispanic Catholics reported they were the most likely to be concerned. But when this came out at the, back in 2014 at the big meeting of the American Academy of Religion where all the religious studies professors go hang out every year before Thanksgiving. This was released and people were very, very surprised to find out that Hispanic Catholics cared the most. Who do you think they expected to care the most? Yeah, they would expect white people to care the most. Maybe Jews, mainline Protestants, right? Those are the people that were expected. So at first, when this came out, people were very, very surprised. But then after we kind of caught our breaths and stopped being quite so surprised, people came up with okay, actually this makes sense because look, Hispanic Catholics care the most, Black Protestants are way up there. I know why. It's because of environmental justice, environmental racism, environmental suffering, right? Communities of color are much more likely to suffer from climate change and other environmental problems, so that must be why they care the most. All right, so that is a reasonable explanation. It's supported by the survey findings, which also found that communities of color, in this survey, they found communities of color were more likely to believe that climate change would impact them directly. This was back from 10 years ago before we had quite as much evidence of the climate crisis around us every day. So people were pretty skeptical. Okay, so everybody's like, okay, we know why Hispanic Catholics and Black Protestants care the most. It's because they're suffering the most from environmental problems. But at that time, I was just finishing up writing my first book, where I was talking about ways African Americans were interested in the environment for reasons that go beyond a narrow focus on their disproportionate suffering. And based on my research from that book and reading scholarship by Alonda Clay, I suspected that there was more to the results of this survey in addition to environmental suffering. I also thought there was more to the story because I'd been teaching at CSUN for a few years already at that point. CSUN is full of first-generation college students. I think like something really high, like 73% of our students are the first in their family to go to college. I think 56% Latinx. It's, a very predominant with minorities and first-generation college students, et cetera. Those students claim not to be environmentalists. So if I walk into a room, I've actually done this experiment. I did it a number of years ago. I was visiting a guest. I was guest lecturing in somebody's class, and I said, like, "Hey, raise your hand if you're an environmentalist." The first time I did it, there were 3 students in the room who appeared to be white, and they were the ones that raised their hand. That was a number of years ago, but I tested it out again this year. Exact same results. All right. My students who are white identify as environmentalists. Students of color don't. Okay, but guess what? I didn't know this when I first started teaching there, but I've gotten to know my students over the years. Many of my students who insist they're not environmentalists engage in all kinds of eco-friendly practices. They ride public transit. They recycle. They don't waste food. They eat vegetables from their backyard garden. But they say that's not environmentalism because it's an expression of poverty or culture, not concern from the environment. They'd say, no, we recycle for the cash. We use public transit because we can't afford a car. So that's not environmentalism. I've seen this throughout my research as well. Community members who are doing things that I would consider to be very eco-friendly, but they insist that it's not environmentalism because they're doing them for other reasons. So the implication is that when I, a white, middle-class, urban, environmental humanities professor, recycle or ride the bus, that's environmentalism. But when people from other backgrounds recycle or ride the bus, that's not environmentalism. So that's ridiculous, right? It seems absurd, but it reveals kind of this hidden moral assumption that a lot of us share when we think about environmentalism. The unexamined assumption is that you have to have certain pure motivations in order for your acts to count as environmentalism. If your actions are motivated by something else, like poverty, necessity, or even concern for fellow humans, it's somehow seen often as less valid as an environmental act. This leads us to associate environmentalism with people like me, who are affluent. I'm not that affluent, but whatever. Affluent and white, but also frequently fly on airplanes, live in relatively sizable homes, own cars, purchase clothes, etc. We don't associate environmentalism with the behaviors of people like my students who don't so intentionally think about environmental matters, yet live much more lightly on the earth. So going back to that story of Maritza and her fellow churchgoers, my students and I were visiting her church in 2015 because we suspected that there was more to these survey results than simply an explanation based on suffering. So I want to take a moment and be clear, the environmental justice movement is essential. We need to talk about environmental racism. My point is simply there has to be more to the story. If we can only think about environmental values among communities of color through a focus on the ways they're suffering from environmental problems, we fail to recognize the many other ways that diverse communities might relate to the natural world as agents, not just as victims. Maritza's example of cultivating plants in order to improve the air quality offers a compelling counter-story that undercuts that dominant framework of victimhood. And Maritza was definitely not the only person in her prayer group that night that described this active set of environmental values. So these stories illustrate a striking need for new narratives of environmentalism. So that's what I'm going to do in my talk. I'm going to demonstrate how our understandings of environmentalism necessarily change when we place Spanish-speaking Catholics at the center. I'm going to start by briefly discussing some ideas that are commonly associated with environmentalism, including both secular and religious coalitions, and the types of activities that these activists support. In the book, I developed this concept called white racial frame environmentalism. I'm just going to kind of touch on it here and use those examples to illustrate it. Then I'm going to discuss another framework that I'm calling La Tierra environmentalism. And this is an embodied ethic of living lightly on the earth that I argue has been hidden in plain sight because it doesn't look exactly like we would expect environmentalism based on that dominant white framework. Drawing stories from my research, I'm going to tell you 3 main aspects of La Tierra environmentalism. And then in the conclusion, I'll discuss the implications of this research for scholarship, policymaking, and activism. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about the type of environmental activism that I grew up with and that might be familiar to some of you. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s in a progressive, white, middle-class family that supported environmental values and the environmental movement. My parents like to say that they participated in the revolution when they were students at the University of Texas in the late 60s and early 70s. And their activism continued into my early childhood. So that's my mom holding my older brother, at an anti-nuclear protest. They're hippies, right? As a kid, I remember reading the book, 50 Simple Things Kids Can Do to Save the Earth. I wore t-shirts and made bookmarks telling people to save the whales. That was a thing in the 90s. My parents became ethical vegetarians when I was in high school, and I followed suit my first year in college. As a college student, I also worked as an intern for the Sierra Club, and I volunteered at a local organic farm. So there's me holding a baby goat, which was a lot of fun. So all of these actions were connected to this idea that it's important to save the earth, that we humans need to save the earth, that environmentalism is something good and something you want to aspire to be. These environmental values that I held and still hold, I inherited these, come from the long history of the American environmental movement, which can be traced to late 19th and early 20th century efforts to protect uninhabited nature from the incursion of human civilization. So this history draws from environmental heroes such as John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt, who worked to establish the first national parks, an effort that was supported by settler-colonial relationships with the land. Aldo Leopold, an early environmental ethicist who advanced his theory of a land ethic, suggesting that the land itself has inherent rights. Have the environmental ethics students read Leopold yet? Yeah. All right. Have y'all read Rachel Carson? Yeah. Rachel Carson, the eminent nature writer who famously sounded the alarm about the harmful effects of pesticides like DDT on what we now call the environment. So these are two canonical writers that you all are familiar with. They're central to the modern environmental movement. And there's a scholar of religion and environmental studies named Anna Gade, who's in Wisconsin. She's written some interesting work about these two figures in particular, that they started this thread of environmentalism that's kind of based on our feelings, and that we have certain feelings of the environment motivated by crisis, alarm, fear, and then alternatively love and hope. That a lot of environmental thought is grounded in feelings. So we need to have the right feelings to inspire action. So these are kind of some of the foundational thinkers that have led to the ways that we relate to the environment now, in many cases. In the 21st century, this legacy is carried forward through public figures such as these. We all know Al Gore. You do know Al Gore, right? I did this with some of my students, and they're young enough that they weren't really sure who Al Gore was. But anyway, Al Gore, who drew public attention to climate change with his 2006 documentary, An Inconvenient Truth. Leonardo DiCaprio has documentaries about climate change and his foundation to fund environmental projects. We all know Greta Thunberg, the famous Swedish teenage environmental activist who began the global movement of school strikes for the environment. Since the 1990s, environmentalism has been a central cause of a lot of religious organizations also, including Hazon, which is an environmental organization that works with Jewish communities, the Global Catholic Climate Movement, and Interfaith Power and Light, which is a national organization. They have chapters in almost every state. I have another one from Interfaith Power and Light because religious environmentalists really like solar panels. There's lots of photo ops of religious people with solar panels. But these groups often rely on scriptural passages, religious traditions, statements, big statements written by religious leaders saying that, if you're a Jew, it's important to take care of the earth. If you're a Catholic, it's important to take care of the earth. All right. What is the theme we note here? What do you notice about all my pictures? They're all white. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So obviously I chose these pictures on purpose to make that point. There's lots of communities of color also engaged in environmental activism. So I'll note Latino Outdoors, Green the Church, which is working with mostly the African American Protestant church. There's a really cool organization in LA called Mujeres de la Tierra. That's kind of a grassroots organization. Ramon Cruz was the first Latino president of the Sierra Club, starting in 2020, and he wrote the foreword to my book, which was pretty cool. And then also the MA students in sustainability at CSUN. So these are all to illustrate, like, obviously I picked those other pictures on purpose to illustrate my point. People of color do care deeply about the environment, but their stories are rarely told. They're rarely included in our mainstream environmental narratives and assumptions about what environmentalism looks like. And that first set of pictures that I showed you, that's what my students are thinking of when they tell me that they're not environmentalists. And I'll just be clear, I'm not suggesting that first set of pictures is bad or wrong, that we need to change everything. It's just that there's other entry points as well, right? So that's one entry point. It's not to say that all that other stuff is bad. I'm just pushing back against the tendency to universalize them and say that's the only way of relating to the environment. And so it kind of pushing back against that universalized narrative is a main reason why I wrote this book, to help my students and fellow scholars and activists see that there's many ways of being an environmentalist. All right, so now I'm going to move forward to my research. We're going back to 2015. In 2015, I started conducting research on environmental values among Catholics in Los Angeles. The first reason was that Public Religion Research Institute survey. I forgot to show you, I'm not going to go all the way back, but if you happen to notice, Hispanic Catholics were at the top and white Catholics were at the very bottom. So initially, I conducted a lot of research both with Hispanic Catholics and white Catholics, and that ended up being defined Hispanic Catholics as Spanish-speaking Catholics. So people who choose to worship in Spanish. They might have been bilingual, but they chose to worship in Spanish. So that was kind of how I found Latinx Catholics. And then I did a lot of research among white Catholics. You can't really just go to somewhere in LA and just find a group of white Catholics, but I had Spanish-speaking and English-speaking Catholics were the two kind of dividing lines. But anyway, so the book ends up focusing primarily on Latinx Catholics, but the research involved white Catholics too, and there is a chapter on my research among white Catholics in there as well. Okay, so the PRI survey was one reason why I started talking to Catholics in particular, and also, has the environmental ethics class read Laudato Si'? Any Pope Francis? I'm going to take a quick sip of water while y'all contemplate. All right. So that PRI survey came out in 2014, and then shortly thereafter, I had kind of already started conducting research trying to interpret the results of that PRI survey, and then I found out that Pope Francis was about to release this big encyclical, this big important church teaching document on the environment, basically arguing that Catholics and actually everybody needs to be very concerned about climate change and take action. So those are kind of like the two reasons why I ended up doing this research project on Catholics in particular. Basically, for the methodology, we started initially conducting focus groups. In fact, before Laudato Si' came out, we were just doing focus groups in this one particular neighborhood, and we were going to try to figure out kind of how different congregations in that one neighborhood related to the environment. But we did this first focus group with Spanish-speaking Catholics, and the findings were incredible. It was like, okay, there's something important here to study. So with that in Laudato Si', we focused on just Catholics. So basically, we did focus groups among both English-speaking and Spanish-speaking Catholics, and we did not say that we're interested in the environment. I basically explained it as a study of how your Catholic faith shapes your daily life, and we'd start asking questions, and then I would shift. I'd said, lately, immigration and the environment have been important issues on the news. What does your faith have to say about that? And then I asked lots of follow-up questions to, take us to the environment, and then at the end, I let them know that's what I was actually focused on. But anyway, so we did the focus groups, and I did a bunch of follow-up interviews with people from the focus groups. And then also I did research among groups of Catholics that were involved with environmental efforts, and particularly after Laudato Si'. There's a group it's not there anymore, but in Los Angeles, there's a group called the Creation Sustainability Ministry, which is predominantly white Catholics, and I do write about them a fair amount in the fourth chapter of my book. And there's another group called Fe Ecología, Faith and Ecology, and that was basically an environmental branch of the Spanish language young adult ministry through the Archdiocese, so I have research with them as well. So basically it's English-speaking and Spanish-speaking Catholics, some who are involved in prioritize environmentalism and some who don't. So that's kind of the people that I was talking to for this research. All right, so now I'm going to tell you what I found through the conversations. When I first started this research back in 2015, community leaders often told me I should adjust my project because they thought Latinx communities wouldn't have much to say about the environment. Several priests told me to visit a predominantly white parish in Manhattan Beach because that church had an environmental ministry. They were doing this whole speaker series on Laudato Si, and they said, if I want to learn about Catholic environmentalism, go to Manhattan Beach. One Cuban-American priest told me that in Manhattan Beach, they have the time and luxury of being able to spend time and resources on environmental issues. But the members of his working class, primarily Latinx parish, were in survival mode. He said they're overwhelmed with the struggles of daily life, feeding and clothing their kids. They didn't have time to worry about the origins of global warming. And yet, here are some of the statements that I heard in my first focus group conversations. And this was with a Spanish-speaking, it was an adult religious education class in Spanish. And the people in the class were fairly recent immigrants, very low income from Mexico and Central America. So here's one quote. From the moment we believe in God and all of his creation, we're already aware of nature and the connection humans have with nature. From the simple fact of being Catholic and believing in God and the Bible, we are 100% conscious of nature and the environment. Here's another one. God created everything and we have to love it. All creation is made by God and we must love plants like a brother. Not protecting the environment is the same as looking at a brother in the streets and not helping him. So even though I was conducting this focus group with those PRRI survey results in mind, I was still really astounded by these statements. My previous experiences with environmentalism, both as a scholar and as a citizen, were defined through this framework of white environmentalism. Within that framework, people of color appear almost exclusively through stories of environmental racism and injustice. So again, those stories are very, very important. But when we discuss communities of color only through a focus on disproportionate suffering, it implies they can become engaged with environmentalism only as victims of environmental problems. Active love and care for the earth, according to this thinking, is restricted to the domain of privileged white activists who have the time and energy to care about the plight of the polar bear. Going back to that slide, I would say if it was the white Protestants who were the most concerned about the climate change, nobody would have said, oh, it's because of environmental justice, it's because of suffering, right? So that was a problem that needed to be explained because it wasn't white people responding. Okay, so, as I conducted this research among working class immigrants from Mexico and Central America, and I heard statement after statement about treating the earth with love and respect, about protecting the limited environmental resources we've been given, about loving nature as a place to meet God. As my research progressed, I found that initial conversation was not an outlier. Through conversations about environmental values among Latinx churchgoers over the following 3 years, I identified a widespread ethic of living lightly on the earth that I'm calling La Tierra environmentalism. All right, what does La Tierra mean? The earth? What else? Any Spanish speakers? The ground, the earth, the ground. Anything else? The land, yes. And then there's one more. The homeland, right? Mi tierra, the homeland. So La Tierra can mean the earth, the land, and the home. So I'm building, when I talk about La Tierra environmentalism, I'm building on the work of a theologian named Jeanette Rodriguez. And she says that La Tierra theology, the way she's worked out La Tierra theology, is that it's a theological perspective that identifies a special relationship to the land rooted in the intersection of Catholic theology and Latinx culture. So she sees this theme in numerous religious resources and poetry, songs, literature across Latinx and Chicano culture. Rodriguez identifies expressions of this special connection with the earth throughout these cultural sources. It's especially tied to connections with the home and the homeland, and a spiritual connection with the earth, family members, and God. So there's a song. I'm not going to sing it for you, and I couldn't quite manage to connect to the internet, so I'm not going to play it for you either, unfortunately. But you can go home and find this on Spotify. It's a very good song. But anyway, it's called Mi Tierra. And these are, this is the chorus. Your homeland strikes your soul when you're gone. Your homeland pushes you forth from its roots. Your homeland sighs when you're not there. The land where you were born, you can never forget, because it holds your roots and everything you've left behind. She flows through my blood, my homeland. I carry her inside me. Yes, indeed. I sing of my homeland, beautiful and holy. I suffer the pain that is in her soul. Although I'm far away, I can feel her. So this is one song among many cultural productions that Rodriguez identifies, that she sees aspects of La Tierra theology in them. And after reading her articles over and over, I realized that her concept of La Tierra theology is really helpful for understanding the environmental values that Latinx Catholics shared with me throughout my research. So what she was talking about among these cultural productions was exactly what the people I talked to were sharing with me. So building on Rodriguez, I define La Tierra environmentalism as an embodied ethic of living lightly on the earth that's rooted in a sense of love and respect for God, fellow humans, and the rest of God's creation. So what I'm talking about here are those home-based conservationist measures that we've talked about already: backyard gardening, not wasting food, using public transit. And I argue these are not just expressions of poverty, they're part of a complex ethical system where living lightly on the earth is a way of showing one's love and respect for God and the family, and it's just the right thing to do. So I'm going to tell you 3 main aspects of La Tierra environmentalism that my interlocutors shared during my research. All right, so the first aspect of La Tierra environmentalism is that it involves active love for nature and concern for global ecological issues. So environmental advocates often try to engage minority communities by talking about environmental racism and environmental justice. La Tierra environmentalism shows that people of color can actively love nature and care about global ecological issues. In my research, Latinx Catholics did talk about traditional environmental justice concerns like human suffering related to the drought. They encouraged food conservation with awareness that many in their community didn't have enough to eat. But many also mentioned active love for nature and the environment, and they expressed concerns about global ecological issues. This was back a while ago. They were concerned about the first President Trump's energy policies, the Dakota Access Pipeline, climate change, natural resource depletion, consumerism, and more. Somebody I'm calling Carlos, I should mention all the names are pseudonyms. Carlos, a 31-year-old electrician who immigrated to LA from Mexico as a young child, specifically told me about polar bears when he was talking about global ecological problems. He said, if you don't take care of the planet, it's really going to be messed up. I mean, have you guys seen what's going on with the polar bears? It's sad, dude. Like, they're dying. I don't know about you guys, but I love animals. Many of my interlocutors also expressed a special connection with trees and indicated that close relationships with trees were a special marker of Latinx identity in the United States. So Carlos, that electrician, he told this story about taking his friends to his grandma's house. And his grandma lived in a predominantly white neighborhood. And he said that when they pulled up onto her block, his friends immediately could identify her house because it was the only one full of fruit trees. Robert was a second-generation Mexican-American in his 20s, and he also described an abundance of fruit trees that were always in Latinx neighborhoods. He said, usually you'll have an avocado tree, you'll have an orange tree, apple tree, guava tree, some type of fruit tree, maybe from wherever they're from. They usually grow here pretty well. And so when I talked to Robert, I'd already heard this thing about trees a bunch. And I was like, Robert, tell me, what's the deal with trees? And he said, well, if you're Latino and you don't have a fruit tree at your house, it's like you're not really Latino. So in many cases, nature is a place to meet God. That was a common theme in the stories, connecting with nature through love and relationality, not victimhood. So dominant understandings of environmentalism tend to think about communities of color through a focus on suffering. La Tierra environmentalism balances cases of victimhood with a focus on the positive experiences and connections that minoritized communities have with the natural world. All right, point number 2. A second aspect of La Tierra environmentalism is that it recognizes a sense of relationality with nature and sees nature as an aspect of everyday life. So in dominant notions of environmentalism, the focus is on saving an endangered planet Earth from human harm. So modern environmentalism is rooted in the stories that I talked about briefly before, connecting to the land through leisure and recreation like camping and visiting national parks. The pristine, unpeopled landscapes that we may love to visit in wilderness areas and national parks are made possible by the forces of settler colonialism and the forced removal of indigenous people and other communities who'd been living in sustainable relationship with the land for centuries. So in dominant notions of environmentalism, nature is out there and it's separate from the experiences of daily life. But in La Tierra environmental narratives, they often center on humans' intimate relationships with the land. So the comment from before about loving the plant like a brother. So I'm going to tell you about Mariana. This is not a picture of Mariana. It's a picture I found on the internet of somebody that has chickens in her backyard. But it's kind of, you can picture Mariana because this person's story is similar. So Mariana was an educator in her early 50s who immigrated to the U.S. from Lima, Peru as a young adult. She had loved nature since her boyfriend introduced her to camping and hiking many years ago. Mariana told me she rarely went hiking or camping anymore, but she loved spending time outdoors. As she explained it, I have a nice big backyard and I like to plant seeds and grow things. And I have 5 chickens in my yard. I like to be with them and hold them and talk to them. I have a lot of birds that come into my yard because there's chicken food everywhere. Mariana said that every morning when she woke up, she looked at the tree right outside her window. I hear the birds and I just thank God for allowing me to hear this music from the birds. Then, when I go outside, I try to make a very conscious effort to recognize that these things are gifts from God. So there's a common concept that people often use to explain why the environment is a religious issue. It's called stewardship. Has anybody ever heard of stewardship? Yeah. Do you want to take a venture at what it is? Fast. All right. Thanks for raising your hand anyway. I appreciate that. It's basically the idea that humans are called to care for the earth because the earth is a gift from God. And this is a very common way that particularly Christian and maybe Jewish communities will talk about caring for the earth. So this is from the website of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles on their kind of creation care page. This is an example of stewardship. God made this earth, not for its own sake, but to be a home for the human family. The good things of creation are meant to be shared, developed, and used for the good of all of his children. And if you'll note here, the earth is in a human hand, right? So it's kind of suggesting, it's conveying, right, that humans are separate from the earth. We can hold the earth in our hands instead of us being part of the earth. In my research, some Latinx Catholics offered versions of a stewardship argument when they explained why it's important to take care of the earth. But there is a second explanation that also emerged across sites, which is this. It's important to protect the environment because of the biblical mandate to love your neighbor as yourself. So that's different from stewardship explanations that put humans as separate from and above nature. This is a more relational viewpoint that sees humans and the rest of nature as part of the same reality. The love your neighbor part is Christian because it directly references the Bible, but the assumption that neighbor involves the more than human world reflects more of an indigenous relational worldview. For many of my interlocutors, the line between humans and the rest of nature was blurred. And many people talked about elements of nature as kin. And I will say that's much more, the book is organized first generation and then second generation and beyond. This is much more common. Nature as kin was much more common among first generation immigrants. But we have this quote from Roger before. God created everything. We have to love all of creation. We love a plant like a brother. Neglecting nature is like seeing a brother in the street and not helping him. Cutting trees is like scorning a brother. And then during that same focus group, another person built on that comment. And he described nature as a neighbor because he said that caring for nature is a fundamental aspect of faith because everything is interconnected. To love God is to love your neighbor. Because God created everything, if we want to be loving to God, we must be concerned with all aspects of life. So by describing nature and trees as part of society, as a brother, and as a neighbor, these comments combine a Catholic commitment to the value of human life with an indigenous relational worldview that blurs distinctions between humans and the rest of the world. La Tierra environmental narratives also focus heavily on recognizing that humans depend on the land. So stories of people whose parents grew up on a farm or a ranch in Mexico, and they knew that they wouldn't have enough to eat if the rain didn't come. I had somebody tell me, for her, you get food at the grocery store, but her parents experienced, you have to have rain to get food. And that, water isn't necessarily something that can just come out of the hose. And so even though she grew up, being able to get food at the grocery store and water from the hose, her parents were always reminding her, that we depend on things and that, that it's not just a given that all of those resources are there. Furthermore, in La Tierra environmental narratives, nature is the stuff that surrounds everyday life. It's the air we breathe, the birds nesting in the trees in the front yard, the mountains outside the window in Latin America. There's lots of stories people were telling me, like, oh, back home, we're surrounded by nature. There's mountains, there's trees, there's beaches. La Tierra environmentalism is about cherishing the relationships with nature in everyday life, much more than or in addition to protecting faraway landscapes from human incursion. There's a sense that nature is a place to meet God. All right. My third, and actually my favorite aspect of La Tierra environmentalism is that it's transmitted primarily in the private spaces of the home, most often through the example of pious, admired women. In the book, I call this abuelita environmentalism, grandmother environmentalism, because there's lots of stories about values learned from mom or grandma. So even when people are aware of church teachings on environmental issues, they often would cite family members as the source of their environmental values. So one example of this is somebody I'm calling Esmeralda, who is a retired school teacher. And she just spent all of her time after retirement focusing on ministries in the church. Homelessness and incarceration were kind of her main issues, but she also was involved with everything. So when there was a Laudato Si ministry at her church, she joined. And that's how I met her, through her Laudato Si ministry. She told me about Laudato Si with great enthusiasm and talked about transitioning to solar energy, making small lifestyle changes at home, recycling more. But aside from answering my direct questions about Laudato Si, she talked much more about the environmental values she learned from her grandma, who was an immigrant from Chihuahua, Mexico, and her grandma had raised her. Esmeralda told me that when she was growing up in El Paso, Texas, her family was really poor and her grandma made everything from scratch. Her grandma would prepare food in the kitchen and didn't waste a thing. She made her own clothing. They would hang clothes on the line to dry. Esmeralda emphasized that her childhood included struggles, but they were really happy. She said even though they were poor, thanks to her grandma's hard labor, she said, we ate pretty good. Rice and beans, fresh tortillas, who could go wrong? So I asked Esmeralda, okay, is this related to your religion? And she said, yes, because my grandma was very, very into her Catholicism. Esmeralda learned her environmental values from her resilient, working-class grandmother, a pious Catholic who prayed all the time. Her grandma was the exemplar of Catholic piety, and since her grandma had embraced conservationist measures, Esmeralda associated those measures with her Catholic faith as well. So retaining practices like sewing her own clothing, turning off the lights, not wasting food, those were ways of connecting with her grandma's memory and embodying a strong connection with God, and just also a sense that it's the right thing to do. Another set of stories I'll tell is from two sisters named Rebecca and Elena, who are in their late 20s. I met them through a focus group. They were involved with a ministry through the Archdiocese, basically for young adult leaders throughout the LA Archdiocese. They were working on a project for Spanish-speaking young adult leaders. So Rebecca and Elena told me that taking care of the environment was an important part of the social justice tradition of the Catholic Church. And they knew a lot about global environmental issues like climate change, the Pacific garbage patch. They were familiar with environmental problems. They also were familiar with Pope Francis's teachings from Laudato Si, but they said the encyclical didn't teach us anything new because it basically just reiterated lessons that they had been learning from their mom throughout their lives. So they came from a family of 4. Their father was the sole breadwinner and he was a garbage collector. And so they told me that growing up, they were very aware of their financial precarity. One of them said, we know the value of $1. Their mom taught them how many hours their dad would work to pay for anything, right? Like, oh, you want that doll? That's 3 hours worth of work from your dad. As children, their family recycled and conserved because that they knew that the environment was in trouble. And their mom also would point out the struggles of workers, right? Like, see that guy selling oranges by the road? Look how hard he's working. He's out there in the sun. He's probably barely making anything for all of his hard work. The sisters associated these lessons with a very expansive view of environmentalism. When I asked them, is this related to your religion? They said yes. And again, they didn't cite the Bible. They didn't cite Laudato Si, although they knew that you could find these things in the Bible and Laudato Si. They talked about their mom. Elena said, being Catholic, my mom always brought me up not to be wasteful. And it was always hand in hand with church teachings, like social justice. You shouldn't be wasteful. You should take what you need, and if you can, give to others. They learned to be environmentalists through their mother's daily prayers. Before every meal, their mother would offer a lengthy prayer asking God to bless everyone who had contributed to the meal they were about to eat, such as the campesinos who had harvested their vegetables. They said prayers over Thanksgiving meals were really detailed, sometimes lasting more than 10 minutes because their mother had to bless everybody. Rebecca said, you think about everything that went into that platter of vegetables in front of you, even the truck driver. So these stories of home-based conservationist measures were widespread throughout my research and often, told through stories from mom and grandma. They're often connected to poverty, absolutely, but they're also connected to resilient, pious women, inherited traditions, respect from family, and God. So in these stories, it's important to turn off the lights to save money, and because it's the right thing to do. And it's also, I'm arguing, environmentalism, right? So in conclusion, La Tierra environmentalism represents one of many overlooked theories of the environment where living in respectful relationship with the earth is not a matter of environmentalism. Instead, it's just a routine aspect of everyday life and a matter of common sense. It might be tempting to dismiss the sustainable practices of working class immigrant communities as merely the result of limited financial means. But refusing to accept their practices as environmental denies the strength of these communities' moral frameworks and perpetuates white supremacist ideologies and our definitions of environmentalism. In the conclusion of my book, I make a few recommendations to scholars, policymakers, and environmental activists, so I'll just share a few things. For my fellow white scholars in religious studies and the environmental humanities, I argue that we need to do better by seeing and uplifting perspectives that might not look like our own. Acknowledging the legitimacy of La Tierra environmentalism requires us to recognize the limitations of our own paradigms and allow our intellectual frameworks to be challenged. Policymakers and environmental leaders can also strengthen their approach by expanding their notions of who can count as an environmental agent. So we need science, like we're in the science building, right? Yeah. This is where they're doing research on sustainable buildings, I think you said. Yeah, we need that. We need research on sustainable buildings from scientists. We need highly trained scientists who conduct research and publish peer-reviewed articles and reports. Those are very important. But we also need to learn from the wisdom of people who've been grappling with the effects of climate destruction for centuries, of environmental destruction for centuries, who are already living in ways that are sustainable and conducive to long-term human existence on Earth. Sometimes the expertise comes from computer models and peer-reviewed articles and reports, and sometimes it comes from the embodied knowledge and life experiences of people whose livelihoods depend on the land. I'm going to offer my final conclusion, actually just reading you the last two paragraphs of the book, where I talk directly to you, the students who are here. So I write, for my students at California State University, Northridge, and other emerging leaders who are bringing their communities' diverse forms of knowledge and expertise to our higher education classrooms, that's you guys, I've written this book to say that we need you. Many first-generation college students draw from multiple forms of wisdom as a matter of daily life. While they've learned to navigate the secular world of the modern university, they also remain intimately tied to the resilient, land-based communities of their ancestors, who knew what it meant to rely on the earth and who cultivated relationships of gratitude, mutuality, and respect. In my own classrooms, students have told me about plant-loving tias who talk to their flowers as if they were their own children. Subsistence farming grandfathers who did not have enough to eat when the rain did not come on time. And the backbreaking labor of parents, aunts, and uncles who toiled as migrant farm workers in the fields of Central California. Over and over again, my students have written about childhood lessons where they have learned that you must take care of the earth because the earth takes care of you. I have written this book to convey that your voices, perspectives, and experiences matter. The models that global leaders have developed and the solutions they have proposed have not risen to the challenges that we face, and the situation with the climate is only getting worse. Please draw from your multiple forms of wisdom and moral frameworks that you value as you develop creative models for a better world and demand that your perspectives be heard. We cannot solve these problems without you.
Thank you. Greg Jarrett here will come up and lead us with the Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. An excellent talk. I want to start, first of all, to ask a question. You do need the microphone as this is being recorded. We do ask that questions have question marks on the end of them. They're not statements about your, ultimate perception of reality. But otherwise, I want to start with my students and then open it up to everyone. Do you have any questions for Amanda Baugh?
Hello. It was amazing. Thank you so much for coming. how would you say that on top of just being of Latinx culture and religion, that class is also a part of the discussion?
I think class is definitely part of the discussion. That's a great question.
Thank you.
I will say the people that I met who are Spanish-speaking Catholics through my research, there were some who were quite wealthy, but their parents were poor, right? So the values that they talk about were connected to experiences of poverty. I will say, I mean, I didn't get to do extensive research with, Spanish-speaking Catholics whose families have been wealthy for generations. I can only say, like, anecdotally, there was one woman who I met in an English language group who came from a very wealthy family in Mexico, and she still had many of, like, kind of the same common sense, don't waste type measures, and more, I think, just kind of, she said when she was growing up, that was like in Mexican culture, that it was just more of not wasting things. But you could say the same thing, like, in the United States, a lot of people who I'll talk to, they'll say, like, oh, my grandparents lived through the Depression, and they do a lot of those same things too. So I think it is experience with scarcity and recognition of that, but it doesn't just go away when, in one generation somebody becomes wealthier. I will say the Latinx Catholics I met in the English language group, so those are third generation and beyond, their stories were much more similar to the white environmentalists. So I think the connection to experiences with scarcity is something that's important. But it could be, I think that's kind of one of the implications of the research, is I think that, telling the second generation, like, to continue passing on the stories that they've gotten from their own parents. So, yeah, good question.
Thank you so much.
Another.
Hello. So why do you think in white cultures, more specifically, that in white environmentalism, that is, why do you think it's more of a dualistic approach to it is taken on, whereas like the earth is something that we need to take care of and kind of, like you said in the picture, like hold in your hands, because it's precious, opposed to something that we're interconnected with and that we're a part of?
Yeah.
Why do you think that split is there?
I mean, it goes back to the Enlightenment, which you're getting me into areas that are outside of my expertise, but I can just say that, European Enlightenment thinking is separating humans from nature. And I'd say that's kind of like the split where this kind of dominant thinking, separating humans from nature, comes from.
Got it. Thank you.
I will choose not to continue, because then I'm going to be in areas that, you should ask a different professor about. Yeah.
Hello. In your book, you mentioned the idea of counter-nostalgia as a critique of mainstream American nostalgia for wilderness. So my question is, how do immigrant perspectives on nature, shaped by the histories of colonization and environmental degradation, expand or challenge this view?
Can you say the question again?
So how do immigrant perspectives on nature, shaped by the histories of colonization and environmental degradation, expand or challenge the view of the counter-nostalgia critique?
Well, the way I use counter nostalgia in the book is basically to say, because when I started sharing the stories about, like, oh, everything is so beautiful at home, you just pick fruit from the tree, and then, like, that's like, it kind of feels romanticized, right? That obviously there's poverty and bad things happen in the countries where people were coming from, but the counter nostalgia frame kind of helps understand why we don't need to just dismiss those as kind of like, oh, that's just romantic, yearning for the past. And the idea of counter nostalgia is that offering those stories of the much better life back home is a critique of the life that's being lived here. So I'm like, I have stories, particularly from that first focus group, those are immigrant churchgoers who are like literally, never seen the sun, because they get up and they go to work and they don't get to see nature. They're like saying, I have to stop and see nature. But then when I go back home, I get to see nature and I see the mountains and the beautiful trees and everything. So I'm saying that those stories are not just like a romantic fiction, but they're using those stories of kind of thinking about when they were agents and humans, right? When they're recognized as humans, to critique the inhumane conditions that they're living in the United States. Yeah. Good question.
Hello, thank you for being here. I hope my question makes sense, but we were talking about earlier in my class about the word environmentalism itself being kind of hard to grapple with, especially if you're from these communities. That word might be kind of what puts people off. And I noticed you have the category of La Tierra environmentalism to describe Latinx Catholic, the way that they might grapple with environmentalism. So my question would be, do you think it is beneficial to kind of have this category of what environmentalism looks like in these communities, or would it make more sense to just eradicate that word in general and kind of get rid of that and create maybe a new term, or not have a term for what this kind of sustainable living looks like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The reason I've retained the term environmentalism is because there's a lot of opportunity there, right? Like there's green jobs, and there's lots of power and opportunity with environmentalism. I think my thinking would be to kind of open up the category so that people see themselves as part of it. But I definitely agree that a different word. I think it's the problem of translation, right? And so to make the practices that you're talking legible for the dominant class in power, right? Like to make them legible. That is why I thought it would be important to retain the term. But I'm definitely, I think, your generation definitely, you can definitely come up with better words and use that. So I hear you, and I have thought about that. And I think because of basically the opportunities around environmentalism is the reason that I thought it would be important to retain it for now. But I'm definitely open to it dissipating and being replaced by a better word that doesn't have all the baggage. Yeah. Do you have one for us? Yeah. It's a good question. Thanks for that. Yeah.
Thank you. More questions, please.
Hi, I was just curious if you had any future plans to research environmentalism in other religions as well, and like how that might manifest or how that might look.
Yeah. So it's a really good question, and because the question is also kind of like what part of this is Catholic and which part of it is Latinx, and I don't have the answer to that because I just talked to Catholics. I will tell you my idea of my next project that I want to do, but I haven't started, nor have I quite figured out how to do it, is to talk. The background is I started at CSUN. I brought this environmental historian in, and he was talking about leisure and recreation and nature. And my student raises her hand and goes, "My dad loves nature. He's a gardener, and he spends his life in nature every single day, right?" And that's always been like planted in the back of my head. I do think like a project talking to gardeners across LA would be amazing. I'm not sure if there's an entry point for me to be the one to do that. But I actually have started a little bit with the PPM crew at CSUN at my campus, the people that are the grounds crew, talking to them. And it could be like city work. So I run in the mornings, and I'm just looking around, like there's so many outdoor workers in the city. So anyway, that I think doing like a religion and work project could be a way to get at that. And the preliminary stuff I've done just on my campus, at first I was like, okay, I'm not finding anything here, but it's the spiritual but not religious sect. And at first I was like, oh, but anyway, if that's the thing, then I guess I have to follow it. So anyway, it's a good question. I do have an idea of how to do a project through religion and work to get at that. And it's going to be, I think this was 8 years between the books. I think this would be more like 15 years because I haven't even really started it. But it's a good question, and you can do the research too. So yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. That was a great segue into some of the things I was thinking about with this focus on labor. So somebody broke down the environmentalism kind of part of your subtitle here. I'm going to talk about the Latinx Catholic part here. How does your book, without having read it, admittedly,
it's not out yet, it's okay.
Relate then to Latina theology, specifically in this idea of labor, and the whole Latino liberation theological conversation happening there within the focus groups that you talked about, especially with your research focusing on Spanish-speaking only, why did you still choose to retain that Latinx title?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, okay, there's a bunch of questions in there.
There are. So choose them. Sorry, I'm all over the place.
I'll say, so Latinx is a really, complicated term, that's got problems, right? And it's, erasing differences, and there's pushback against it, and actually the people that I talked to didn't use it, right? Like that's not the term that they use to identify themselves. Spanish speaking Catholics actually is the empirical way that they group themselves in my research. So like in LA, when I go to a focus group, like it wasn't just Mexican Americans, because in LA, our Spanish speaking population has, Central Americans, Mexican Americans, those are the main ones. But anyway, so they group themselves because people are like, you're erasing differences if you use that term. But the Spanish speaking Catholics is not erasing the differences, because that's how they grouped. That's how they were grouped when I encountered my interlocutors. And in the Catholic spaces, they are grouped together. And honestly, I in the book mostly talk about Latinx or Spanish-speaking Catholics. I use Spanish-speaking Catholics, and you just couldn't really put in that subtitle the values of Spanish-speaking Catholic environmentalism. So that's the short answer to that part. Do you want to talk about liberation theology, or? I mean, the main theologies that I use in the book are the La Tierra theology, and then also the Abuelita environmentalism comes from a framework called Abuelita theology. You're familiar with that? Yeah, so I'm drawing on that. I do draw some on the work of a theologian. His last name is Castillo, and it's obviously his name is escaping me now, but he writes about an ecological theology of liberation, and basically says that Gutierrez didn't really include the earth just yet, although maybe towards the end he kind of did, but that if you follow it to the logical conclusion that the earth is included in a theology of liberation because of that blurred boundary, I would say. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you. I just wanted to add one thing from our class today. A topic came up. Earlier we read a little bit of Lynn White. We hadn't seen that slide of white Catholics.
Yeah.
And I noticed Lynn White wasn't in the index of your book, and I was kind of expecting to read that. And so obviously he's drawing on different aspects of Genesis than what your folks were reporting. So do you think there's maybe Lynn White is right about the white Catholics? Or
every single environmental studies and religion ecology book cites Lynn White. So, I mean, what I say about him is that he's important for starting the conversation. Can I pass? I don't know. I don't know if he's right about. I don't think. One of the critiques, as you know, of Lynn White is that he had the idea that text belief translates to what people actually do, and I do think with the white Catholics it's not because of the Bible that they have those things, right? So I don't think that they support him. But thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So let's open this up to anyone who has questions.
Just piggybacking off of his topics, within the Latinx subgroup, did gender play a role? Because I know you talked a lot about how the mothers and grandmothers were really close with nature. So was there a gender subgroup within the Latinx community?
Well, I don't know why it happened this way, but it was more the people that accepted my interview requests were often women. So the kind of the home-based stories are from women. Where I encountered men the most is actually this, the Fe Ecología group. It was almost entirely men. And interestingly, so they were trying to be environmentalists. So basically what I'm kind of showing in the book is that the people who weren't setting out to try to be environmentalists, they would say Laudato Si is nothing new. This is how we were raised. But for Fe Ecología, who were trying to be environmentalists, their model was white environmentalists, and they said environmentalism is Laudato Si is brand new. Environmentalism is brand new in our families. We have a lot to teach our elders. They have a lot to learn from us versus the Abuelita environmentalism. They have a lot to teach us. And then their authorities were the priest. This is new to the church because the priest is only now starting to talk about it. So I don't do the gender analysis in that sense, but the men that I happened to talk to were doing like more hierarchy, authority, and looking to the formal church and the priest. And when they didn't see that stuff there, then they're like, oh, environmentalism is new to us. Versus, I mean, there were men that told me about stories from their grandmas and their moms too, but it was mostly women. So it's a really good question. I don't dry that out a lot, but yeah, I guess there was a little bit of a difference that I don't dive into.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for presenting. It's amazing. But I was just wondering if, like, in the past, I guess, nearly decade since you started conducting this research, if you have seen, like, a more apparent shift in, like, how those, like, the perspectives in these communities are presenting themselves in terms of, like, I guess, relating to the urgency of the climate crisis and how much more, like, publicly spoken about it is. And even just, like, you know, in relating to, you know, changing presidents or even policies. I mean, I grew up in LA and there's, you know, so many different discussions around like expanding infrastructure and, you know, expanding public transit and things like that. But I was just wondering, you know, in the past years, like if you've seen like any kind of major shift.
Yeah. Well, in terms of like the talking to people part, that honestly, like the pandemic kind of, that was the end for the research. It was, you know, with ethnography, you could go on forever. And so at some point you just like stop, and I just kind of stop. So, I mean, and the people that I'm talking to with La Tierra environmentalism aren't like the ones marching in the streets and saying these things. So like, I guess, unfortunately, I don't have research to answer your question. I will say, sadly, the Fea Kolahia group folded, or they're just not active anymore. And there was they were actually somewhat active through the pandemic. They switched everything to online, but they just kind of have fallen out too. And no, I haven't seen that. It doesn't mean it's not happening. It's just that I haven't been in the areas to.
Or even just like maybe on campus, like the students that you've spoken to.
You know, it was like literally, because the story that I told you about the only the 3 white students raising their hand, that was from years ago. And so I literally tried it again thinking it would be different, and it wasn't. Like literally, and the poor students, they were freshmen, they were really embarrassed because it was embarrassing to talk about race, but it was literally the 3 white kids again that are raising their hands, and then they kind of, you know, are ashamed. I mean, I'm the director of a sustainability MA program. So, I mean, those students are certainly concerned and aware. But in terms of the general student population that just like comes to my gen ed classes, I honestly haven't seen. It's just kind of not on their radar as much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. This is awesome. I don't want to close things down. I just want to get in a question. Methodologically, 2 related questions. Who are you to them? Like, how do they relate to you? Right? Ethnography is all about relationships. How did you, in comparatively short amount of time that you have with people, get them to open up, how they react to you? And then related to that, how did you convene these groups? You mentioned focus groups. People's time is precious. Getting a hold of people is hard. I'm just genuinely curious how you managed to pull that off.
Yeah. Okay. So the second one's easier. Basically, I would go to a priest. I would go to a church, and sometimes it'd be sometimes go near campus, or like initially there was this one neighborhood we were focused on. Sometimes it was, I had students who took me to their churches. And sometimes it was like, okay, I should go to a church in a wealthier community. Okay, let me call up this priest. And, you know, so anyway, basically I would introduce myself, tell them about my research, and then go have a meeting. And then they would set me up with a group. And it worked best when it was a group that already meets. So it's like a religious education class or some sort of fellowship that meets the 3rd Wednesday of the month. And then they would it would be set up that we could come talk to them then, or maybe they meet the 3rd Wednesday of the month, but they'll meet with me the 2nd Wednesday of the month instead, or something like that. So pre-existing groups, definitely. There was one we did where the priest just kind of announced, it was like after Wednesday morning services, and the priest announced it a bunch of, and we actually got good turnout there, but it's all like senior citizens. So anyway, so that existing groups is the best way that I was able to do that. In terms of my positionality, I mean, I kind of talk about this in the intro of the book. Like, I'm not actually the right person to write this book. I did get very limited stories, right? Like I had students with me, and that did make people feel more comfortable, and they would often tell the stories to my students and not to me. But it is a very limited view, and I think my hope is that this book kind of points to you that like there's something there and that other people need to go fill in the thing. Like you're going to come up with something better than La Tierra environmentalism, right? I read in grad school the book by Pamela Clausen called Blessed Events, and she's great at talking about positionality, but basically she's somebody that studied home birthing women, and she was somebody who'd given birth at home, and she talks about how that very much shaped what people would tell her, and they would assume she's an insider, and they would like if she'd never been pregnant, then they would have told her completely different stories. I'm very much an outsider. People were very generous and they would talk to me, but it was very, very limited. So I'm just scratching the surface. So the book is kind of saying I think there's a lot more out there to be found, and there's definitely going to be things that I got wrong because I couldn't go that deep. So it's up to you all. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for being here. I had two kind of broad questions. The first, with the research you've done in your background, the Latinx Catholic environmentalism kind of community that you've talked to and done research on, what is the biggest reason you would say that population of people, or just population of religious people in general, haven't made such a huge impact on the crises that are happening with the climate and environment today?
Can you say more what you mean by haven't had an impact?
Not haven't had an impact, but why hasn't there been a drastic change with such a large population of people in general that are caring about the environment?
Can you say more about kind of what kind of change you're looking to see?
There's still a lot of widespread pollution, and like you said, the trash ocean island thing. Like, there's so many people in the world that care about the environment, but we still see large amounts of trash and pollution. And what's the biggest reason you would say contributes to that?
I mean, I think policy, industry, like lots of large forces, I would say. I'm not sure if I'm quite getting to your... You're just saying how come everybody hasn't risen up to change everything? Consumerism, capitalism, industry.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah.
Second sort of small question, it's just basically your opinion. What would be the largest thing that if you had control over the policy and that sort of things, what would you do to change it?
I'm going to have to say I would go to a policy expert, which I am not. So I wouldn't be a good one to be in charge of one important policy, because that's not my area of expertise, but it's a good question.
Yes, I enjoyed the talk, and we need more studies like this. So my question is about, did you encounter people who were not environmentalist or even anti-environmentalist in your fieldwork? And did that have anything to do with upward social mobility or economic mobility? That as certain people got wealthier, and they started to be consumerist, and they're more alienated from nature, from the land, because your examples are people who were very poor who have to be thrifty, and people who remember their grandmas or their mothers who were peasants and rural people who were working on the land, and they are interacting with natural living things. So once they leave that, or maybe they become workers in a factory, they don't get to connect with the land or the plants and animals. Maybe they become hardened, and they even become anti-environmentalist.
I didn't encounter any anti-environmentalism. I mean, there could have been people that just didn't speak up because they could read the room, right? So there was nothing anti-environmental. I will say, particularly that one young adult group that I talked about with Rebecca and Elena, they were like people that were handpicked by the Archdiocese because they were like rising stars. And so for like the income, they did a demographic thing check. Anyway, some of them were at like $250,000 or more per year for their annual income. So they were very wealthy. But they still told me these stories about saving. And I didn't go to their houses. Like, I don't know what kind of car they drive. But they definitely had stories to tell about, the values that were given to them. And the thing, this is something that kind of like hardened the contrast for me. So a couple of years ago, I did a talk kind of along these lines on Zoom, and my dad was one of the audience members. And afterwards, he called me and he said, Amanda, this is in our history too. Your grandfather only owned one swimming suit his entire life, okay, or his entire adult life, okay. But he never told me that, right? Like, that was not a value that was passed down to me. So for the young adults that I met who are very wealthy, I don't know how they were actually living, but I think the fact that they had those stories and those values that were already there, and that they had stories to tell me about them is different from how I was raised. And I think it's significant that they had them. Whether or not they're enacting them, I don't know. Yeah.
So I think we have time for just one more question. Dusty?
Sure. I was wondering with some of the quotes, what was specifically Catholic about them?
Yeah.
For several, I thought, you had an early quote talking about we're Catholic, so creation, but it could have been Christian, and the sentence would have read just as easily and well. Did people talk about Pope Francis? Anybody talk about Saint Francis? Or are there any specifically Catholic things that came up in the conversations, or was it even though they were self-identified Catholics participating in conversations with you, was it just generically about God, creation, love of God, love of relationality with you?
The second, it was much more general. Yeah. And honestly, the only people St. Francis is like the go-to, like, if you were Catholic and you need an eco-saint, you got St. Francis, right? And so the Fea Ecología group who are trying to be environmentalists, right? They would quote St. Francis, but nobody else brought up St. Francis. I mean, the thing that was Catholic was the Catholic grandmas. Yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Very good.